Well, there's this Max Beckmann show that's coming soon to Neue Gallery. If you haven't been to Neue Gallery, it's quite a place. It's just up the street from the Metropolitan, and they specialize in German and Austrian expressionist painting, but they tend to cast the net a little bit further at times. Um, so Max Beckmann was um, between the world wars one of the most successful German painters of his time. Um, the the show itself that is going to be at the Neue is going to focus specifically on the formative years, the years um, from 1915 to 1925, which is basically his transition from his early career as, basically he was a very talented academician as a young painter, very ambitious, but it was the transition through World War One that really um, uh, changed his focus, and he became the painter that we have come to know. Um, he had a nervous breakdown. Basically, let me go through. He had a nervous breakdown. He volunteered as a medical assistant in the trenches, and lived through a year of the war and had a nervous breakdown. And basically, they relieved him of duty. Um, so I am going to cover more than just these formative years because I feel like to get a fuller sense of who this guy was as an artist, you need more than that. Um, this is a very interesting focus and helped me to understand his work in a very different way. But the really kind of the thematic focus of Max Beckmann's work can be summed up in a quote from Shakespeare in As You Like It. All the world is a stage, and all men and women merely players. They have exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many roles. He acts, his acts being seven ages. So what you're seeing here on this first page is two of the he did 40 self-portraits or more. He did 85 self-portraits in all. Um, what you're seeing here is still self-portrait as clown, which he was about um, I'd say he was in midlife. He was about 39 or 40 when he painted that painting. And the one on the right is from 1950, the year he died. So self-portrait as clown really kind of sums up the 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 theatrics of his work. Um, he's sitting there, he's holding a slapstick in one hand. You see the mask kind of falling down off of his face. He's wearing the collar of a clown, uh, has the horn in his lap. The horn comes to play many different roles in Beckmann's work. So we'll move on. I'll do some bio stuff on him first, and then so Beckmann was born in 1884, died in 1950. Was married twice. Um, he actually, let me see. I've got some. Uh, Although he's known as an expressionist painter, he really didn't um, like that classification very much, rejected both the term and the movement. The movement is very subjective. It was very much about um, using color as an emotive force, and it was very, you know, introverted in certain ways and extroverted in others. Um, his notions about this, um, he develops something called the new objectivity, whatever the heck that means. But it really is about social, political, psychological um, imagery, really trying to deal with social change or transformation, or a kind of point of view, a very satiric point of view of what society is about. So Beckmann was born to a middle class family in Leipzig. Um, in his youth, he became interested in art and really pursued a career. Joined the academy, had very rigorous academic training, um, and actually, I'll talk more about this when we get into the imagery. Won some prizes, was really his in his even in his pre-war career was getting a lot of notoriety and a fairly decent amount of success. Um, he was very much concerned with um, what he was well read, literate, um, contemplated mysticism and theosophy. It was really he was a true painter thinker. Um, so, there's this reaching beyond the um, the physical dimension. There's a kind of mythopoetic basis that's in his work. Um, he refused to explain his paintings, and you'll see that there's a lot of very interesting narratives that are very mystifying in his work. I'm going to move on. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Paris Society. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to be careful with my voice. I'm having a little trouble. Um, Paris Society is a painting which he started in 1925, which is the end of the period that we're going to be looking at in this show. But it went on um, through the war, so it kind of changed its nature through all those changes. Um, but I will come back to this painting. But you get the kind of social satire that goes on in his work. Okay. Let me move my window here. Um, this work was created when he was just 21. Exhibits young artist's strong intellectual background, deep visual awareness of the human form. He included multiple nudes in a variety of stances. Um, and this is a big canvas. This is 58 by 92 inches. So it's very um, uh, large, ambitious canvas. He was influenced by Van Gogh and Cézanne. Um, and several other really going into the Renaissance painters. He was also influenced by a number of German Renaissance painters, Bruegel, um, uh, Grunwald, and a number of different ones. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. Uh, okay. Um, ooh, all right. Uh, Beckmann became a volunteer World War One, as I said, helped in the hospitals as a medical orderly, was discharged due to a mental breakdown. Um, and this was really the transformation of his career. The political, social, economic issues existing in the wake of the war in Germany were heavily explored in his work. He became known as one of the pioneers of, I'm not going to try and pronounce this German, uh, but the new objectivity movement, which developed to portray the weak state of the country in the post-war conditions. And as we all know, there were really rampant political issues that were going on in Germany between the wars. The Communist Party, the anarchists, there were nationalists, there were all these conflicting, and, and there was a very weak democracy in place. Um, so, all right. So below you see a couple of self-portraits that show you kind of the transition and in actuality the small death scene. His mother died of cancer um, in the middle of it all, and this piece reminded me so much of Munch, and that was of course another influence on Beckmann. Okay, uh, here we go. uh, Despite his initial success, um, Beckmann subsequently transitioned to this more expressive style uh, and adopted to the dramatic topics that he wanted to represent. So here's a self-portrait as nurse, uh, and this wacky painting with him with a champagne glass, which is it's a wonderful strange combination of things. Looking at that Google-eyed fellow in the background over there, there's a there's definitely a dreamlike quality to Beckmann's work, which becomes more and more pronounced as we go forward. Okay, and here we have um, Descent from the Cross by Beckmann, and you can see the direct correlation to this Grunwald crucifixion. Most crucifixions are kind of cleaned up versions of what it would be like to actually go through having nails stuck through your hands and your feet. Grunwald did not back away from it, and neither did Beckmann. Um, it really was part of the expression um, of the agony in the crucifixion, but the agony in the post-traumatic syndrome of Germany, and it kind of, this piece encompasses that. Okay. And here is the night. Uh, so again, this kind of nightmare that Germany was living through as a society. Um, it displays this kind of bleak mood um, in, in an increasingly gruesome way. Um, Many of the horrors portrayed, basically um, for Beckmann, there was no higher purpose or reason um, to replace the literal suffering that he witnessed with biblical images. Um, so he decided to go straight into it and portray the agony and torture. Um, Fortunately, he does not stay in this state, so we're going to move on from this right now. Ah, and here is family picture. So, as I said, he was married pre-war. They had, I believe, two children. Um, uh, and he cast himself in this family scene on the left, lying down on with a bandage on his head, um, with a cigarette sticking out of his mouth, which happens a lot in a lot of his self portraits. He's either holding one in his hand or sticking it in his mouth. Um, and then there's this horn. Now, is it a horn to hear with, a horn to play? A horn plays a lot of different roles in Beckmann's work. And again, it's this kind of dreamlike, um, really compressed space. It's very much, a cubistic kind of shallow space, this stage that he plays on. Uh, okay. And here's a Bruegel. And it gives you some idea of the kind of density of Bruegel. There are many of these scenes. Um, uh, there there's a, it's a little like Bosch in some cases. He does go into that level of fantasy, but I wanted to show you this kind of density of things going on. And this is one of Beckmann's inspirations. Uh, and again, the shallow, dense space, these kinds of dreamlike um, uh, relationships between people. Sometimes they're in contact with each other. Very few. I mean, if you look at the dancing couples, they're all looking away from each other or looking. This guy in the on the left is kind of looking very intensely at this woman that he's dancing with, but she's got her eyes closed and she's someplace else. Um, we've got this couple in the foreground, which are having some kind of uh, flirtation or conversation. Um, but there's a lot going on. It's very dense. There are all these figures layered back in there. And on the left, this gallery Umberto, He did make trips to Italy, so he was seeing the growing fascist business that was happening in Italy. Now, he would not say that this was directly about that in any way, but and again, there's this fish thing that he's got going. Not exactly clear about what that is, and he wouldn't tell us. So the fish appears in a number of different paintings and a lot of different situations. There's these dismembered figures and things like that. Crazy stuff. He was very much into the nightlife. Um, okay, so here's the story. Um, this is um, the man himself, the master of ceremonies, the sideshow Barker, standing between his first and second wife. Um, Papi was 20 years younger. Um, his marriage with his first wife had long since ended. It was really after the war that they were living apart, um and they divorced. Um, Puppy was 20 years his younger. Um, she was quite beautiful. Really, this was really a second transformation in his life. You come out of the war with this transformation into this dealing with the horror of it all, and and his marriage to Puppy really transformed him again. She was well connected in the art world. Her family, um, her I believe it was her father was a really successful artist and was very connected in that area. But she was also this lovely, young, talented woman. Um, she was a singer, I believe, an opera singer. Um, so this really, this joy came into Beckmann's life, and it really was something that he embraced fully. And so here we are, the artist and his wife in 1925. Uh, the sailor came back from the sea. So the wonderful part again is this business of the clown, the jester, the um there's a wonderful quote that I often like to say to my wife, and she says it back to me. uh it's a quote from Fireside Theater. uh we're all bozos on this bus, and I think that Mr. Beckman would go right along with me on that one. Um, so there's this wonderful, fanciful quality to this. He loved to go to masquerade balls and things like that. He loved the theater, loved to go to um, hear music, to go to high and low theater. Um, Fascinating. And there was quite the social life in Germany at that time. Um, so back to Paris society. So one of the things that he um, really kind of recognized is that in order to really um, expand his market, um, he knew that he had to move into the international realm. Um, he went to Paris, um, and this is one of those parties that was being given at the German, I believe the German embassy or something like that. Um, but there are, there's actually a YouTube, there's actually two YouTubes that focus on this specific painting and talk about identify as many of these characters that are in this little play. Um, but Beckman captures the anxiety of a broken culture. There's this effort on the part of some in Europe to to regain an international collegiality, a kind of cultural society, and there it I can't even remember what the name of the kind of international club that had been formed, but there were several different groups of people that were trying to pull together culturally the threadbare relations between states in Europe. Now, this is you know, it starts out pre depression, but the painting is completed when the depression is full tilt in 1931. Actually, he came back and revised it or revisited the painting in 47, but the bulk of it was done by 1931. And there are all these characters in it. I can tell you a couple of them, which is in the foreground on the right, the guy in the on the bottom of the painting that's holding his head in his hand is actually the German ambassador, who was somebody who was trying to rebuild relations between Germany and France. And um, by 1931, that had become pretty impossible. Uh, so it's a very uh, full painting with a lot of characters. Now, again, look at these folks. The only two that are locking eyes are those two across the room from each other, uh, which is another interesting little tidbit here. Uh, okay. Okay. And again, here is Beckmann in this kind of regal stance, a card-carrying member of high society at this point. Uh, quite the fellow. And like I said, I think of him more as a, a, a director of these characters rather than a painter. Ah, okay. On one panel, Beckman highlights the torture scene with several figures whose hands are bound. They appear to be forced to commit violent acts. Um, the side panel on either side portrays the artist's vision of the brutality and violence inflicted by people on other people, which casts a dark vision of humanity or lack of. In the middle panel, there's a woman tied to a man, um, who hangs upside down. I can't quite make that out. It looks like a child in there to me. Um, the scene, the scene in the middle panel represents the possibility of salvation, um, through the family in the wooden boat floating out to sea. Fisher King is seen as casting his blessings over the scene. The mystery of the world is represented by the ominous figure of a hooded man who holds a fish. Now, again, Beckman would have a fit if he ever heard somebody explaining his painting quite that distinctly, but here we are. Uh, I got to make some effort. Okay. And again, the acrobats, the 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 circus, the the aerialist, the magician, the um the gamesmanship of of our world. Um, so this one is let me see. That's some written here on this one. That here we go. Here we go. Um, Beckmann's diaries. So by this time, they actually in 1937. This is worth going back to. In 1937, Hitler came out with this uh, speech in which he said um, all of the decadent art would be banned from the museums, and artists would no longer be allowed to paint outside the the prescribed um, art of the Reich. Um, Beckmann and his wife left Germany the day after that speech. Um, they through the war lived in Amsterdam, and he continued to be able to paint. But in Beckmann's diaries in Amsterdam, he recounts various visits to cabarets, theaters, the circus, um, and the paintings of the acrobats, the lofty heights of the circus tent, um, the improbability of these kind of close-in views. Basically the the little acrobat on the right, the crouching acrobat on the trapeze, is one of the examples of a single painting, but this other piece is gigantic. It is a giant triptych. Now, triptychs are kind of uh, religious in their connotation. And in the middle panel is this snake charmer holding, I believe it's either a skull or a crystal ball. I can't tell which. Maybe it's both. Uh, um, but he comes back to this somewhat dark view of human nature and the world. Um, it's really the 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 ability to thrill the viewers, to astonish the mind and the senses, and he portrays that by giving us these really dense, richly filled paintings that have layer upon layer of objects and interactions that are so ambiguous and yet really interesting and intriguing. Ah, and again, the crossover into this inspiration and competition with the Parisian modernists. With these still lives, Matisse and Braque are the inspiration and rivals. Um, uh, and here we have on the left is a Matisse still life with a mirror, and on the right is a floral from Braque. I'll go back, and again, you see the mirror, you see the use of these um, semi-cubistic, though he never goes all the way over into a formal cubism. There is a colorism in these pieces that he's definitely taking from Matisse, and there's a formalist structure that I see as having a relationship to Brock, um, and we'll go further into that a little bit later. But there's also this other guy. Um, Yeah, okay, here we go. Here is the other Brock that I wanted to show you. And very subtle, wonderful painting by Brock. These grays and subtle warm and cools, and the the use of the mandolin and that the beautiful shape that he wavers in and creates in the sort of the center of the composition. It's very musical. Um, there's also the journal and those polka dot areas that are in the center um, area on the toward the top and a little bit on the left hand side in the Brock is actually a shorthand for newspapers. And here we have Beckmann on the right with his full out newspaper coming into the foreground and his different kind of use for the vessels and way of distorting them and using that as um, a method to move the eye through the composition, but also a way to concentrate our focus. Um, Beautiful color in the Beckmann also. Ah, and then there's the other guy that he's in competition with. So this is a portrait of Minna Beckmann, who was Beckmann's first wife. And here is a portrait of Olga by Picasso. And you can see the kind of neoclassicism that they're both playing around with. The other one that I didn't integrate into this talk, which I wish I had, is Liget. Liget was friends with Beckmann and very influential on him. There's a kind of volume that Beckmann brings to his figures that comes from Liget. Um, but the other what? There we go. Here's another one. Um, this is a Beckmann painting, but it is kind of in the vein of the Blue Period Harlequin series of Picasso. Um, Picasso's not the only one who can paint a clown. Uh, and Rouault. And the use of blacks is definitely something that Beckmann picked up on from Rouault. He was back and forth to Paris, so he saw all these guys and saw the developments that were happening there. Um, so this is a pretty wonderful painting too. But I'm going to keep moving on because want to. I got a lot to fit in. Let's see. Rape of Europa, 33. Again, Picassoid, The Business of the Bull, uh, but also the things that were happening in 1933 are clearly being crystallized in a painting like this. And here we have a very, very powerful piece, Hell's Birds, or Bird's Hell, excuse me. Um, you see all these guys doing the Heil Hitler business in the background and the torture that's happening. in the foreground. Um, this is really kind of the birth of fascism and you know, this uh, six-breasted crazy creature cracking out of the egg with um, a great Heil Hitler. Um, Beckmann was no lover of Nazis, that's for damn sure. Um, and he saw this all as being just a horrendous fruition. Um, it's really kind of Hieronymus Bosch, this kind of entry into hell. Ah, and here we have two more self-portraits from around the same period. Um, and there's that kind of sly look on the tuxedoed nightlife fellow. And the other one with the horn, is he using it as a as a telescope? Is he using it to hear what's happening, or is he beckoning a call to arms, or is he calling out a danger signal? Uh, Probably all of that. Oh, wait a minute. Um, so this was one that took place during the war, and it's a very dangerous game. You see them cutting the cards on the deck on the table up above. They cut it with a sword, not with a hand. And these ladies are gambling on the table. This fellow in the background, what's that he's got in his hand? It looks like a sledgehammer. Uh, okay. Now this is beyond what is going to be in this show. But I wanted to show you this work so that you would get the the depth and breadth of his work. And here is Otto Dix and George Gross, two of his fellow uh, kind of new realists, and they were looking at the trauma of the war and the grotesque quality of what life was like in Germany between the wars. Uh, ah, this is a late piece now. This is from 1950. So by this time, okay, during the time that he was in Amsterdam, he was trying to get to the United States, but during the war, they would not allow him because he was a German national. Um, um, by 1947, he got permission to come to the United States. Now, Beckmann had great success in America. He actually pre-war had a show. He had a show in Manhattan in 1923, which sold very well. And he had repeatedly had shows throughout the years in America, though he didn't come to America until 1947. But he really loved America. When he got here, he was he looked at New York and said, "This is like Berlin, but bigger." And he loved his city life in Berlin. Um, so he only got to spend a week or two in Manhattan to begin with when he first landed because he had a teaching position in at Washington University in Missouri. He was replacing oh God, what is his name? Philip Guston, who was teaching out there at that time. And so Philip Guston took a leave, and um, Beckmann went out and taught there for a year. Um, During that time, there was a collector of Beckmann's work, which he bought um, dozens, probably hundreds of his prints, but also dozens of his large scale paintings, and eventually donated all of them to the St. Louis Museum. So they have a really large holding of wonderful Beckmans out there. Um, so this wacky painting was from 1950. This is the last year, but it was really a wonderful, strange conglomeration of things. Uh, Still a lot of wacky action, semi-sexual uh, theater. I don't know what's going on here. Okay. And this is Beckmann in 46. Oh, okay. These are a couple of his portraits. Now, he did a lot of portraits, which are really wonderful portraits. Um, I threw in down in the lower right hand corner a Lester Johnson, who was a wonderful painter from the basically from the I think he was 30s through the 1980s. Maybe it was, oh wait, he lived until 2000 something. So I think it might have been 2004. He lived right over in Greenwich, Connecticut, but well-known artist, but definitely influenced by Beckmann's work. And he did a lot of Beckmann did a lot of these portraits. I didn't show many of his other portraits. I focused mostly on his portraits of his wife and himself, but there are these wonderful portraits that can be found. And I think this Fred Conway may have been the collector that bought so much of his work out there. And Edie Rickey was the wife of George Rickey, who is a kinetic sculptor who probably was teaching out there too. Don't know for sure, but they somehow crossed paths. And here is, one more of these magnificent paintings of women with fish. Um, and so maybe we're talking about men. They caught the fish, or they're doing something with the fish. I don't get too far with that one. Uh, so again, uh, Broadway scene with Lester Johnson, Philip Guston, again, very influenced by him. If you look at some of those Ku Klux Klan paintings and things like that, you can get the social commentary and satire that's in Guston's work and the relationship that he had to Beckmann. Um, and Alice Neal in her early work, um, and actually throughout her portraits, she uses a lot of black, and she very much was aware of Beckmann, and acknowledged that she saw a show of his work in New York, in I think it was the 30s, and that very much influenced her. And so we're back to the the carnival, the masquerade ball, the masks, um, very strong women. These images. There's some cards cast aside down there. one of them is a jack. Uh, so it's kind of like casting men aside. Um, at least that's one way to interpret the symbolism, but she is a very powerful figure, and that very strong triangular composition, very grounded. Uh, and again, we look at the gesture, the masked gesture, the masquerader. He's holding a slapstick in his hand, and there's this um, skull in the dead center of the painting. So it goes. Oh, okay. There's a number of YouTubes. I didn't there's actually probably going to be a YouTube it's associated with this show. Um, this is his last self-portrait, which I showed you right at the beginning of the talk. It's a very strong, colorful image, but you notice that the clothes don't quite fit. He's kind of shrinking away from his clothes, kind of like dissolving in there. He had angina, and in going on his way across Central Park, he had a heart attack and died. He was on his way to the Metropolitan Museum to see this painting on display. So I will leave you with that note. Um, there are a number of YouTubes on Beckmann. If you look them up, you'll see that there's a couple of them that are on that Paris Society piece, which is well worth a watch. We're going to be doing Ruth Asawa, which is a show that is on at the Whitney, and it's wonderful work, but you're not going to be able to see it because of my focus. Okay. Well, anyway, it's drawings. It's a very different place from where we've been with Mr. Beckmann, but well worth a trip to see.
Okay,
Okay,
thanks,
thank
Art.
you.